Thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in all of our virtual programming, not only our book talks, but our virtual movie night discussions, our trivia nights, our drink and draws, and all the other great virtual events that we do here at the museum that we're going to keep doing in 2023. So look forward to all of those. But thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation. And of course, support for the foundation comes in the memory of Pat Finley. So thank you to the Finley family as well. We still have a couple people coming in. This is excellent. Today, we are welcoming Professor Megan Bever to our book talk program. Megan is an associate professor of history and chair of the social studies department at Missouri Southern State University. She received her PhD in history at the University of Alabama in 2014, and she is the author of At War with King Alcohol, Debating Drinking and Masculinity in the Civil War, which is what she's here to talk to us about today. But she's also co-editor of the Historian Behind the History, Conversations with Southern Historians and American Discord, The Republic and Its People in the Civil War Era. And she also has articles published in the Journal of Southern History, Civil War History, and the Journal of Sports History. Her current project examines interpretations at state and local Civil War sites in Missouri and its border regions. Dr. Bever lives in Carl Junction, Missouri, with her husband and 2 children. So, Dr. Bever, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm really happy to be here with you all on this winter day. We've compared weather forecasts, and apparently my weather is just a little bit nicer in southern Missouri, but I'm happy that we're all warm and cozy inside. When I talk today, I am actually going to share a PowerPoint screen, so I'm going to start sharing my screen now, if I can get it to work. And so I will be using slides to narrate and add some illustrations to what I'm talking about today. So I would like to begin actually in Virginia at Germanna Ford along the Rapidan River. To set the scene a little bit fuller, it's December 1863. And the 5th New York Cavalry is building their winter quarters on a hill nearby the ford known as Devil's Leap. The hill is pretty thickly wooded, and in fact, Confederate soldiers encamped on the other side of the Rapidan River are racing to cut the timber for their own winter quarters. So as the men of the 5th New York Cavalry built their homes among the hills, they were cold, wet, and miserable because rain fell. And the camp adjutant kept the building on task. He had the men pool their carpentry skills, and they were building shelters as quickly as possible, not just to get the timber before the Confederates got it, but also to get themselves out of the weather. Everything, as far as I can tell, went smoothly until December 30th, when the adjutant took a break. He went off for a jollification time with an old crony, so we're told. And after what must have been a very enjoyable evening of drinking, the adjutant returned to the site of the camp and decided to make use of one of the deep dug sinks that presumably had just been constructed by his hardworking soldiers. Unfortunately, the intoxicated adjutant lost his balance and tumbled into the latrine trench head first. And again, in the account, we're told that he spoiled his entire suit of clothing. The adjutant in this case suffered no long-term ill effects of his tumble, although work on the camp construction did grind to a halt the subsequent day. And I assume this was because he was hungover and or doing laundry, probably both. But most of the cavalrymen in the 5th New York found his misfortune to be absolutely hilarious. Everyone but the chaplain, it seems, thought it was funny. And it is quite hilarious, even more than 150 years later. But why I point it out and why I start here this afternoon is that it also contains this story plenty of the typical elements of soldier drinking during the Civil War, and I'll just point out a few. The soldiers in the story were cold and wet from exposure. They were performing what they called fatigue duty by building winter structures. They were in winter camp, the places they lived during the months where they weren't campaigning. The officer was seemingly the first to get drunk. And the mishap in this case caused by the drinking was fairly minor, but it did prevent the completion of tasks. So my plan for this afternoon is to spend some time exploring the military culture that led this poor adjutant to inadvertently dive into the latrines at Devil's Leap. Because while it may seem somewhat random, I argue that the military regulations that were in place led to this drinking. And I want to look at the ways that liquor was an integral part of military medicine and military life. Then subsequently, I'd like to demonstrate that soldiers and officers in turn used various forms of liquor for self-care to treat themselves for various ailments. And the result, as we've already seen, was a chaotic environment full of mishaps and uncompleted tasks. So to begin today, I'd like to look at liquor's medicinal uses in the Civil War armies. And I'll start by saying that when we think of alcohol, we tend to focus in 2023 on its numbing effects, that it can relieve pain, it can even relieve a cough sometimes. We also, of course, are aware of its emotional relief, however, maybe maladaptive or temporary that relief is. But when the Civil War began, the medical community did not describe alcohol this way. And in fact, they don't usually call it alcohol at all. They are much more likely to call it liquor or spirituous liquors or ardent spirits. So I try to use liquor more often than I use alcohol when talking about it in the 1860s. The medical manuals published early in the war describe alcohol as a stimulant, not as a depressant or a numbing agent. Confederate surgeon John Julian Chisholm, who published widely during the war, described two ways that liquor could stimulate the body. It could reinvigorate the body after it had lost a lot of blood, and it could restore nervous energy when men were suffering from shock. Union Surgeon General William A. Hammond noted that when people became intoxicated, the nervous and circulatory systems become excited, the mental faculties are more active, the heart beats fuller and more rapidly, the face becomes flushed, and the senses are rendered more acute in their perceptions. And because of these properties, Hammond believed that too much liquor could be a violent poison, but he also urged Union hospitals to keep liquor on hand at all times. So in the war, surgeons near the front are instructed to prescribe alcohol when soldiers are sick, when they're wounded, in order to stimulate the body to help it recover. So every use of liquor in the 1860s, every official use of liquor, I should say, is designed to give the body a jolt, if you will. So keep that in mind. So what I want to look at now is how this actually looks in practice. And I'll start by saying that both Union and Confederate armies, when they publish their guidelines on how to use liquor, the guidelines look really similar. And in fact, both armies, both Union and Confederate armies, I realize there are multiple of these, they base their regulations on the pre-war United States Army. So the Confederates often simply copy or slightly adjust US practices and adapt them for their own uses. And this is definitely true when it comes to medicinal uses for alcohol. So the most obvious times that Union and Confederate military hospitals use alcohol is when they're treating acutely ill soldiers or helping men to treat their wounds. So this is, and this is what I was just describing, this idea that alcohol or liquor is a stimulant. that if you give someone whiskey, brandy, or wine, it helps their body, it kind of steals the body against whatever camp illness they might be facing, or against a wounding. The medical manuals do mention that it's important to be super careful when someone has a head injury, that too much liquor can make that worse. But there is this understanding that liquor can help men who have been wounded. Beyond those most obvious uses, the medical departments in both the Union and the Confederacy use liquor to try, whiskey specifically, to try to prevent malaria. And to do this, they mix whiskey, which they can get most easily. They mix it with quinine. So we have an American twist, if you will, on the gin and tonic. So just to provide a little context here, in the 1860s, physicians, scientists still don't know that malaria is a mosquito-borne illness. In the British Empire, and then subsequently the US Army, the British have figured out that malaria tends to occur in swampy, low-lying areas. And again, Civil War surgeons will write about this too. They can tell that malaria is worse closer to stagnant water, but they don't really understand why. The British and the Americans also know that quinine can treat malaria. They actually think it can be used as a prophylactic. They think it can prevent malaria. It can't. It actually just treats the symptoms. But they use quinine to try to keep the soldiers from getting sick. The problem with quinine is that it's really bitter. And if you've ever tasted tonic water, you know this. Quinine has an edge, and such an edge that it's pretty undrinkable straight. So the medical departments have to cut the quinine to help the soldiers get it down. And for American soldiers, the way that they cut this quinine is with whiskey. So anytime the armies are encamped near water, especially after 1862, medical departments start doling out whiskey and quinine rations if those supplies are available. And again, they're doing it to try to prevent malaria or treat its effects. So beyond these two sets of uses that are really for illness or preventing illness, there are regulations for additional uses of liquor that stretch beyond the medical departments and bring in the subsistence departments. So military regs in both the Union or the United States Army and the Confederate armies say that whiskey should be used when needed to mitigate cases of exposure. And I think this is somewhat related to preventing malaria, because malaria is happening when soldiers are exposed, in the minds of 1860s physicians, when they're exposed to bad air or bad water. But this idea of mitigating exposure means that soldiers get whiskey rations whenever they're stuck in extreme elements, if there's supplies. So if men are wet, if there's snow or there's mud, if they're cold or damp, they get whiskey rations. Again, supplies allowing. And the idea is that the whiskey, again, can give the body a jolt, can stimulate it a little bit, and prevent soldiers from becoming ill. So these rations are particularly common when men are serving picket duty, especially if that duty is being conducted when it's incredibly cold or incredibly rainy. And then finally, the fourth use of whiskey rations are that they're used in cases of treating extreme fatigue. And officially, this means that soldiers can have whiskey rations anytime they're performing fatigue duty. So all of those military tasks beyond fighting, building bridges, digging trenches, burying the dead, building winter quarters, as we saw in our opening. In practice, what happens is that this fourth category gets expanded pretty broadly to include anything that's exhausting. which is not really what the manuals mean, but it gets applied to long marches and other exhausting activities, sometimes fighting itself. So these definitions get broadened. When you put them on a PowerPoint, these 4 uses look pretty straightforward. They're easy to categorize all the official uses into these 4, I guess, columns, if you will. It's pretty, what's also clear is how much liquor is supposed to be in a ration. They're usually measured as a ration, which is 1 gill, or a half ration, which is half a gill. And I just put this conversion up so that you can understand how a gill compared. So, it's a shot or two, a little more than that. So they're not small rations. But the guidelines seem straightforward enough, and obviously no one is going to get completely intoxicated if they just take 1 gill or 1 ration of whiskey when it's officially doled out to them. The problem, though, is that in practice, the guidelines are actually not very specific at all. And most of the confusion comes from the fact that supplying the ration is typically left to the discretion of a commanding officer. And in some cases, the general, a prominent general or a commanding general, is going to make those decisions for the army underneath him. So one example of this is after the Battle of Fredericksburg, in the winter, December 1862, General Robert E. Lee says that there are not going to be Christmas rations for the Army of Northern Virginia. So it's just dry throughout the ranks, at least officially, because Lee makes the decision for everyone underneath him. But just down the road, you've got the camp of the Army of the Potomac, which is under the command of Joseph Hooker, and Hooker does the opposite. He's just been promoted. He's just replaced General Burnside. He himself wants to celebrate. It's also Christmas. And so General Hooker gives whiskey rations to pretty much everyone in the Army of the Potomac. So in this case, you see 2 generals, kind of on opposite sides of the river, making 2 different decisions about handing out rations. This isn't really typical. Most times the decision about whether you hand out a whiskey ration actually gets passed down the ranks. So the implementation of a ration can really vary from regiment to regiment, even from company to company, based on who's in charge. So if a colonel or a major is a teetotaler, you're probably not going to get anything. No rations, no matter if you're doing fatigue duty or if you're sitting in the rain or whatever. Other times, your company officer may be ladling out whiskey and defining fatigue, as broadly as he wants. And this really leads to the confusion on the ground, right? You have a lot of company level officers who are deciding for themselves in the moment what they think constitutes exposure and what they think constitutes fatigue, and also how they're weighing those definitions against what's going on around them. So an example of this confusion comes when men have to march. Some commanding officers will give a whiskey ration to men in the midst of their march or before it begins. Again, the idea is that it will stimulate the men and sort of steel their bodies for the march. It doesn't really work like that. Whiskey rations tend to promote straggling, and maybe this is not surprising. And perhaps the most infamous instance of whiskey-related trouble occurs during Burnside's mud march after the Battle of Fredericksburg. And in this case, soldiers in the Army of the Potomac are incredibly demoralized. They've just suffered a really excruciating defeat, and the Union officers try to cheer them up with whiskey rations. It's muddy, the weather is disgusting, and the men become drunk and they start fighting. So this is an example of when the drinking, sort of the officers make the decision to introduce whiskey into the mix, and it just leads to chaos. Other times, commanding officers decide to wait until what they think is the end of a march before they give out the rations. So the stimulant comes at the end. It helps the body recover from the exhaustion, but it doesn't, ideally, it doesn't disrupt the march itself. But even then, the issue is that the orders change so often, you're not really guaranteed that you're done with a march. And an example of this this is a Confederate example, from the summer of 1863. This is when Confederates in the weeks following Chancellorsville, they decide they're going to invade Pennsylvania. And so you have Confederate troops who have crossed the Potomac River from Virginia into Maryland. It's rainy, it's muddy, and Confederates, the soldiers were told that they would have time to eat dinner. And their commanding officers, because it's rainy, because it's muddy, because they're trying to combat fatigue and exposure, they give the men whiskey rations with their dinner. And about a third of the soldiers got pretty tight, which suggests that the whiskey rations were pretty generous. But then orders come down the chain of command that the men are going to march. They're actually not stopping for dinner. They're going to keep going. So the soldiers are drunk through, and I don't want to say through no fault of their own, but kind of through no fault. I mean, they've been told it's okay. They then have to drag themselves. And they slip and they on the riverbanks and they're rolling in the mud and they can't manage to get up and get their footing. So this is yet another example where officers think that their decision for whiskey rations is fine, and it ends up causing chaos because of the way that orders are shifting over their heads. Where I think the most, or maybe I should say one of the most extreme broadenings of that definition of fatigue comes into play is when commanding officers decide that battle is an example where men deserve whiskey rations. And obviously, this is not what the military considers fatigue duty. But officers' perspective seems to have been that if you need whiskey to dig a ditch, you definitely need whiskey to charge a hill, that there's a reason that you would need this stimulant. And in general, the understanding was that it calmed the nerves. But again, like with marching, this could really backfire. And an example of where this happens is during the siege of Petersburg in June 1864. A captain from Massachusetts gave his men a whiskey ration right before they were going to be engaged. And instead of fighting, the men actually dropped into a little ditch outside of a line of trees. And the captain is just left there. He begins to cry. He's screaming at his men, begging them to get up, to go form a line. They're telling them that they're disgracing themselves. And I think the fear here is that men might stop fighting if they're drinking in battle. And that's certainly what this captain's colleagues are thinking, or comrades are thinking. They're watching him in horror because he's given his men liquor and they are not performing their duties. And so he's disgracing himself. His men are disgracing themselves. So a lot of officers will avoid giving men the ration while they're in battle, but they'll give it to them immediately after. And this seems especially true when men are celebrating a victory, either theirs or someone else's. So, and this is where again, another huge stretch of official regulations. So in one case, Union General Fitz John Porter actually hears of Union Army successes in Tennessee in early 1862. So he hears of Grant's successes, and he gave all his colonels permission to issue those celebratory whiskey rations to their men. And again, I think, so the men are celebrating a victory, but it's not theirs, right? And Porter gets really exuberant. He predicts that the Union Army will take Richmond within 6 weeks. So maybe he's a little optimistic. But I think in this case, what we're seeing is that Porter is using those whiskey rations because he thinks that they will raise morale. And again, this is not really an official use, but it's very much an expansion of those official uses, that liquor is a stimulant, that it will sort of give an exhausted soldier's body a jolt and more energy to keep going. And so I think that Porter is using the liquor here to celebrate something good that's finally happening for the Union Army after a lot of stalemate and a lack of progress in the East. What's important to remember is that, and because I've been talking about drinking as if it's widespread, so I just want to clarify that unless a soldier got an official government ration at the request of his commanding officer, enlisted men were not supposed to drink. Officers can drink. They can keep private stores of liquor. They can buy liquor from camp merchants. They can get passes to go to town and drink. But enlisted men in the Civil War were not allowed officially to procure their own spirits. They're not supposed to buy spirits from the camp sutler. They are not supposed to go to town and drink. They're not supposed to go to town at all without permits. And if they do have a permit, they're not supposed to drink when they're there. But enlisted men do drink against the rules all the time. So that's just something to keep in mind. And what I find is that when enlisted men procure their own spirits unofficially, they also base their own uses of liquor off the Army's regulations. And they employ what another historian, Catherine Shively, has called self-care. And Shively argues that early in the war, medical departments really fell short in what they could provide for soldiers. And so soldiers made their own individual plans to keep themselves healthy. Foraging, for example, to find maybe fresher foods or vegetables or fruits. Liquor plays a role here, I think, and so my work is building on Shively's. And I argue that the reason that soldiers are comfortable using liquor for self-care is that they've grown up using liquor medicinally. So soldiers are not unlike medical professionals in this regard. Soldiers believe that liquor can be used to treat illnesses. And they've grown up in homes where wines and brandies are kept on hand in case someone becomes ill. So when the soldiers became sick in the armies, which is quite often, they typically try to find liquor to treat themselves, especially if official rations are not forthcoming. And so I see this more often among Confederate soldiers. So Union soldiers discuss receiving rations a lot because the Union has better supply. Confederate soldiers talk about trying to procure their own spirits. Again, this is because the Confederate military doesn't usually have a steady supply of liquor on hand, and so soldiers are being forced to scrounge for their own medicines. And Confederate soldiers do use liquor to treat a rather interesting variety of ailments. One example is the case of a Texas soldier, Elijah P. Petty. And I'm going to quote him a little bit, but he used about 4 fingers of brandy and a bath in a spring to treat a fever brought on by a severe cold, a case of piles, and a very sore and painful ripped fingernail that was undoubtedly infected. He seemed to think that the brandy and the bath, that combination, left him ready for a full discharge of his duty. So he's using brandy as a catch-all, I guess, if you will. Another Confederate soldier from Mississippi, this is Robert Moore. He blamed a rainy March for landing him on the sick list with the measles. He purchased brandy and ginger, made himself a brandy-infused ginger tea, and according to him, it made the measles go a little easier. And soldiers really expanded their uses of spirits beyond treating infected thumbs or head colds. Like commanding officers, enlisted men interpret exposure, exhaustion, and fatigue really broadly. And I think much more than the official documents, soldiers talk about mental fatigue. And one of the places that I see this happening is in winter camp. And I think, you know, when most of us think of the Civil War, we really don't think about winter camp. And maybe that's not true when, you know, talking to a group of veterans, but I think a lot of the places, like when we think of the Civil War, we just think of, you know, the 20th Maine just over and over and over again, 4 long, glorious years of this. I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, but in fact, this is not most of the war. Soldiers spend much more time in camp than they do in battle. And by and large, fighting stops throughout the winter, and soldiers end up living for months in these massive tent cities. So what soldiers do when they move into winter quarters is they try to make these shelters as home-like as possible. They try to make them warm, they build little pieces of furniture for them, and they do anything to try to make them comfortable. And so one of the ways that I find that they make themselves warm and comfortable in these little winter homes is by drinking. Some men write about keeping jugs of whiskey by their beds. This is especially true of officers. It seems straightforward. They're combating exposure, staving off the cold. They're not really, that's not how liquor works, but they think they are. But men also write about keeping warm by playing whiskey poker. And this seems to be a bit more than just combating exposure. It seems clear that they're trying to pass the time, trying to relieve boredom. They're certainly trying to recreate some kind of the familial environment that they've left behind. So when soldiers talk about drinking in their tents at night while playing games, there seems to be an element of emotional self-care here. And this emotional element becomes clearer around the holidays, especially at Christmas. And this is really where I see a lot of drinking combined with a lot of angst. Christmas is, you know, I mean, it's a time that most soldiers were used to drinking as part of their celebrations with their families. And they go to fantastic lengths to find liquor around the holidays. A few friends in Walker's Texas division pooled their money to purchase whiskey at about $40 a gallon in order to have a frolic, that's their word, on Christmas Day. Soldiers in the 17th Mississippi paid between $30 and $50 a gallon to buy liquor for a grand camp dance to celebrate Christmas. This is not just Confederates. Union Corporal Robert Rossi and his own friends made punch, according to him, for both Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. And on the latter holiday, according to Rossi, they had a lot of fun and didn't get to bed until around 3, all of them dutifully drunk. So I think what these men are trying to do is to make Christmas in camp as much like Christmas at home as they can, but it doesn't work. Sometimes the men wait for their families to send them care packages. When those packages don't arrive, they become, and this I'm quoting another soldier, melancholy. Another example of this is Charles Francis Adams Jr. From the Adams family, the 1D Adams family, famous in American history. He complained to his family that his Christmas dinner was of tough beef and commissary whiskey in February 1862, and asks them to send something better the subsequent year. In another case, a Florida soldier named Robert Watson drank a little, but according to him, it did not feel very merry because his thoughts were of home. So these descriptions are similar actually to the way that soldiers describe sickness, the way that they describe picket duty, other times where they use liquor medicinally, and the liquor becomes an attemptive curative for homesickness as well as other forms of sickness and exposure. So what happens as a result is that men end up drinking pretty much whenever it suits their personal needs, and they can find the liquor. They can't get liquor anytime they want a drink. Again, sorry, the Union Army has a pretty fairly steady supply of rations. It doesn't always include liquor, but a fairly steady supply of rations. The Confederates have a really chronic shortage of whiskey. They only use it in their medical department, and the surgeons, when they have it, prescribe it really sparingly and really specifically in order to try to keep it on hand for when they really need it. But just because government rations are scarce, that doesn't mean that soldiers don't manage to find liquor on their own. So men will sneak into town and buy it from civilians. Camp merchants will sell illegally to enlisted men. Men's families will send them care packages with liquor in them. And these men are spending most of their time encamped in the apple and peach growing regions of the United States, or of the Confederacy in some cases. There's a lot of apple brandy in Virginia, for example, and 19 and 20-year-old men are really, really good at finding it. So again, just because there may be shortages at the broad level or the upper level, for individual men, they can often find little bits of liquor to drink. And this presence of liquor, even if it's, a very small amount, can absolutely wreak havoc with camp discipline and lead to all sorts of mishaps. Men complain about drunken soldiers making a lot of noise, so they can't sleep. Other times men stumble. I mean, we saw this at, the top of the hour, a man stumbling into the latrines. More seriously, men will stumble into enemy lines and get captured or killed, or they will tumble into a creek bed and drown. So this becomes serious very, very quickly. Other men fight when they're drunk. They seem to be much more likely to fight with each other and with their commanding officers. And in the best case scenario, the drunk men end up being put under guard until they sober up. And that seems to be the way the military deals with it. More seriously, the fights get incredibly violent. For example, a man named Joseph Herring of the 7th Illinois Cavalry was shot in the arm by a drunken soldier. And in fact, his suspender buckle managed to bounce the bullet off its course and save his life. But in other cases, men are killed. Major Joseph Bullen of the 28th Maine was shot by a drunken soldier and killed. And a member of the Union Army's Excelsior Brigade, that's Sickles' brigade, shot another member deliberately for no reason whatsoever, just because he was under the influence of liquor. And I will say that these instances of violence, I think they frustrate and anger not just commanding officers, they really anger enlisted men. And enlisted men get angry too when officers are drunk and misuse them. But I think there is a real men become furious because of this extra violence that liquor is causing, that they're already in a violent enough situation, right? War is inherently violent, and the men are already dealing with the effects of that. And then when there are drunken fights and there's needless killing and needless violence that should be avoidable, I think men become incredibly angry and incredibly frustrated. Even if they're drinkers themselves, they become incredibly angry about the disruptions caused by this violence. And I think related to the concerns about the violence and the mishaps that go along with the drunkenness, both Union and Confederate medical departments are concerned about the overuse of liquor. And as I transition into this, I do want to point out that the 1860s are very much a state of flux, a state of transition for the way Americans think about illness. And this is true in a lot of categories. But specifically for now, I think it's important to understand that Americans don't think of alcoholism as a disease in the 1860s. The word alcoholism isn't in any kind of, it doesn't exist. So in the 19th century, when people see a person who drinks too much, they interpret that drinking not as an illness, but as a moral failing. And so many people believe that everyone who even tries one drop of liquor is at risk of becoming a chronic drunkard, a moral failure. This doesn't mean they don't notice the symptoms of what we would consider the symptoms of alcoholism. So they notice delirium tremens. So they see the shaking, they can see the confusion that occurs when somebody is withdrawing. But if they see a person suffering from DT, they're going to regard it as a consequence of immorality, not as a physiological problem and a sickness. And so related to this is the notion that liquor is regarded as a stimulant. And none of the Civil War era medical books talk about its numbing effects. So soldiers are not officially using liquor as pain relief, but unofficially they seem to completely understand its numbing effects. So they would never describe liquor as taking the edge off or sort of numbing the body from pain, mental or physical, but that absolutely seems to be what's happening, even though they don't describe it that way. And physicians realize that soldiers overuse liquor, especially soldiers who are sick, who are wounded, and physicians think that this is a problem. So even though in the 1860s, physicians haven't quite fleshed out a medical understanding of addiction, they recognize that soldiers are intoxicated too much. And so they try to control the flow of liquor in the hospitals as much as possible. And in Confederate hospitals, especially, physicians will require prescriptions for whiskey and brandy, in part to control the overuse of alcohol, but also to save supplies. Northern hospitals, though, where there's not really a shortage, they try to curtail chronic intoxication. And most of the evidence that they're combating this comes from the newspapers produced by these Union hospitals. And I'll just quote a few examples. So the Soldier's Journal instructs soldiers not to sit down listless and inactive, and thus enter a course that will make you a curse to yourself and to everybody else, because Uncle Sam foots the bill and furnishes rations. And the Cripple, sort of a problematically from our point of view named newspaper, described drinking as a vice which betrayed the hidden faults of man and showed them in odious colors and faults to which he is not naturally subject. Wine throws a man out of himself and infuses qualities into the mind, making him a stranger in his sober moments. And virtually all Union hospital newspapers advertise temperance clubs, which urge men to pledge not to drink liquor. And it's impossible to tell from the newspapers how effective these suggested alternatives to drinking were. I think what we can conclude from the evidence is that drinking was a common enough problem in Union hospitals that they're devoting a lot of column space to combating it. And it tells us that soldiers' self-medication was not entirely understood by the medical community. That soldiers are drinking when they're bored, homesick, or in pain. And society's understanding of their drinking is that it's a moral failure rather than a physiological condition. So where does that leave us? And I think the large question is, what can we learn from soldier drinking? And I think on one level, we can conclude that the military regulations in both the US and Confederate ranks didn't work as they were intended. That liquor was widely used when it was available, that soldiers expanded definitions of acceptable drinking to suit their purposes, and the commanding officers facilitated the drinking despite the chaos they knew it would cause. But I think there's a larger takeaway here as well. And I think that's especially true if we put together the study of wartime drinking with our studies of veteran drinking. And a historian actually retired from Marquette, just down the road from y'all, James Martin, a few years ago wrote a fantastic study of Union Civil War veterans. And Martin argues that Civil War veterans coped with chronic pain from their injuries, from mental trauma, from the horrors they experienced, that they coped with this by drinking. And not surprisingly, these veterans struggled to readapt to a civilian world where the prevailing belief was that all men should work hard, usually through manual labor, to support their families. So many of these veterans drank, they continue to self-medicate, and mainstream society, especially in the North, shuts veterans off from the world, I think figuratively, but also literally placing them in homes behind fences. And so if we step back and look at the war, I think we see that soldiers are beginning to cope with its horrors, the exhaustion, the mental fatigue, while they're living it. That they're using these medicinal definitions of drinking and expanding them in order to drink during the war and take the edge off whatever misery they're experiencing at the moment. And over time, it leads them to become men who behave outside of what civilian society is expecting of them. And I think in some cases leads civilians to seeing soldiers as somehow less manly than the men who didn't fight in the war in the first place. So that's all I have for my presentation this afternoon. I'm looking forward to taking some of your questions. Thank you.
Well, we have plenty of questions, Dr. Bever, plenty of questions, a lot of interesting ones. That was a great talk, and it really just brought up so many different issues. You know, I'm over here writing questions myself, and I couldn't even keep up because there's just so many different areas where this just expands into. And then at the end, you brought it into modernity, looking at our current veterans and some of the problems that they're facing. And it just comes full circle. But I'll get started on these real quick. Give me just a moment to bring these up. This way first. There we go. The first question, Dr. Bever, what was the most eye-opening moment that you came across in your research?
Oh man, that's a hard question.
It's just so many of them, huh?
So one of the things, and this actually isn't in my talk today at all, but one of the things that I discovered while I was doing research is that Confederate states passed prohibition at the state level, which historians had sort of touched on before. But I found it absolutely fascinating because we think of temperance and prohibition as being a northern phenomenon before the war. But in fact, it's the Confederate States. They're trying to conserve grain. But they really launch these moral crusades against distillers, talk about how disloyal they are, how evil they are, how they're, stealing grain from women and children and causing soldiers' families to starve. So I found that whole discussion and the relationship between distilling liquor and disloyalty and a lack of patriotism, I found that to be absolutely fascinating.
God, that sounds like there might be a part 2 of your work just in that topic alone.
Well, there's a spin-off article on it, but yeah, it's more than a chapter. So yeah.
Were there like deliberate daily rations for the Army on either side, such as you would see in the Navy, or was it just kind of catch as catch can?
I think it's just it's really location specific and it's really commanding officer specific. So there are some cases where they're getting daily rations, like if they're encamped along a river. I think there are cases where, especially in southern Tennessee, that Grant is giving it out every day. But it seems to be, rather than, the Navy, where you have that constant steady flow of it. In the armies, it seems to be very location specific, very commanding officer specific, and then in the Confederate ranks, not regular at all.
Okay. When did alcohol start being used? Sorry, I can't see the alcohol start being used as an emergency disinfectant for cleaning war wounds. Was that, was that right around the time that you're talking about, or was that did that come on later on?
I think it comes on later. I was actually talking about this with somebody the other day, and I don't know, because they're not disinfecting. The germ theory comes after the war. So they're not disinfecting during the war, and they're not, the Hollywood thing. I think this is the context it came up in, but that Hollywood image of, dumping whiskey on a wound to clean it out before, that doesn't happen in the war. And I'm not sure when the military medical departments start disinfecting, sometime after we know about germ theory, but I'm not sure they would have used liquor. Unless it was just an emergency, I'm not sure liquor would have been used in that way. It's a really good question, but it's beyond the 1860s.
Okay. You keep referring to, supplies as necessary. What would be some of the reasons that these soldiers would not, especially the upper echelons, not be able to get these supplies of alcohol during this time, especially from the northern armies? And I think the question here refers to like the commissaries or, those who kept, the rations.
Yeah, so there are multiple levels. So in part, it depends really on how far away the soldiers are from the supply centers. So if I'm looking at supply records for the Union Army, I see the closer you get to Washington, D.C., the more liquor you see going out to those, to the camps in Virginia and nearby. And I think, and also you're closer not just to distribution centers in DC, you're also closer to manufacturers in the north and north of the Ohio River. Where I think it gets more dodgy is just the more networks you have of supply, the more liquor ebbs and flows. But you do see it come in anytime. And Earl Hess has done really good work on supply and logistics in the war. But you see liquor pop up pretty regularly once those supply trains are running, even on into the Deep South. The biggest places where I see it being disrupted are places in the Trans-Mississippi, Missouri and Arkansas. And a lot of times when I see it being disrupted there's actually a note that says, like, we can't use the roads because of guerrillas. So any place you've got irregular violence or partisan violence that's disrupting those supply chains, you're going to have less liquor. But really, when the Union can get their supplies running, not not always, there's more in Virginia, but it still comes with Union supply trains. I would say more regularly than not.
And then I was just curious, do you see soldiers, especially when they're in their winter quarters, do you see them, like distilling their own, sorts of alcohol or I don't know, I don't want to say beer maybe, but
Yeah.
some simple forms of whiskey or brandy perhaps?
Yeah, I see them. I actually think I see beer more often, and not very often. But there are a few soldiers, especially German American soldiers, they try to brew their own beer. And I can think of one instance where a guy is he's trying to make lager, which is pretty, I mean, because you've got to keep it cold when it's fermenting. So, and he has to move, like his camp gets disrupted. So I don't see them trying to make their own. I see them trying to make, I don't know that we would call them cocktails, but there are multiple instances of them like trying to make their own eggnog with stuff they've cobbled together, or trying to make their own punch. But it usually involves something they've purchased from someone that they're mixing with something else. And they often comment that it doesn't really taste very good. So
yeah, and the whole talk I was constantly thinking about the eggnog riot at West Point in the 1820s and how much trouble that caused.
yeah.
Let's see, we'll move on to the next question here. Roughly what kind of percentages did you come across regarding, those who were teetotalers and those who would drink, when they could?
Yeah. So this was hard to get at. So what I did to try to figure out kind of my teetotaling ranks is anytime I could find numbers about temperance societies in camps, I tried to kind of see how many members they had. And so the data is really iffy, but what I found is about if there's a temperance society in camp, it's probably going to involve about 10% of the soldiers, which seems pretty small. But that's roughly, I mean, the temperance movement as a whole in the United States never really comprised more than 10% of the population. And it was huge as far as, the results that they were able to get. And just to compare that, abolitionists were even fewer than 10%, and they had a really robust movement. So I would say about 10% of soldiers are probably teetotalers, and then you have that whole spectrum beyond that. But I would say that most men fall in the camp of thinking that moderate drinking is fine, that their drinking is certainly fine, but that anybody who drinks more than them is a problem. So they're very, very American in that regard. But yeah, somewhere in the middle, I think, is where most of them are.
I like the way you put that. The bar stands with me, and anybody above the bar, well, they're in excess.
Absolutely.
There were times, that's been documented where men drank liquor instead of water when the latter wasn't available. And like this audience member says, notably in the Kentucky campaign. And aside from straggling and things like that, what other effects did you think that might come across and hamper their movements?
I think straggling is the big one. And I think, in part because sometimes they struggle because they're looking for it. Sometimes they struggle because they're drunk, and they get lost. And those are really the biggest things that I see. And I don't really see, you have those little instances like I shared of the men getting drunk in battle. But I'm not one of these people who says you can blame the disaster at Chancellorsville on drunken men. I just don't think they have that big of an effect in battle. I do think but I would say that straggling is probably the biggest, or related to that, being absolute pains when they're in town. So the problem too is that the soldiers will go into town, the civilians will sell them liquor, give them liquor, not always to be mean, like sometimes they're just doing it to be nice, I think, but the men will get drunk, they'll raid storehouses, they'll be just generally nuisances. And this is a real problem if the Union Army, for example, is trying to subdue some town in Tennessee, right? Especially if you're trying to win back hearts and minds, which by late in the war they're not. But so the men interacting with civilians while they're drunk is a huge problem for both Union and Confederate authorities.
Yeah, we've seen that played out in so many Clint Eastwood movies too, haven't we?
Yeah.
You used the term earlier, Dutch courage. Do you know where that came from?
Did I?
I think so. And if not, are you familiar with the term?
I mean, I don't think I used it or not on purpose, but so the idea that you're drunk like a German and you can, yeah, we explored that idea. And that you get your courage from your liquor. I don't know where the term originates. There's certainly in the war a lot of notion that the German American soldiers drink too much. And I think there's a lot of jealousy there because German soldiers get beer rations when native-born soldiers don't. But then you also have both sides, and I don't think they always associate it with Germans, but you have both sides accusing the other of their patriotism being whiskey fueled. Like their cause is corrupt, so the only way they can get brave enough to fight is to drink their patriotism from a bottle. So I see both Union and Confederates hurling that charge at each other. So it's the same idea, right? That you manufacture your courage because you don't have it.
Yeah, I could see that being kind of maybe like an insult almost.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
When do we start seeing alcohol being discontinued for use to treat illnesses like wounds and fatigue?
You know, I don't know. So this is, I make this joke often that my knowledge of history ends as soon as the Archduke is assassinated. Like I'm out. But and that's not totally true, but I don't know when the military moves away from that. So I know during Prohibition, like one of the reasons that Prohibition doesn't work is because alcohol is still being manufactured medicinally. And you know, even today, if you check the label on your cough syrup, it's probably, especially a nighttime cough syrup, it's probably still got a little liquor in it. So I think it's phased out in the 20th century, and but I don't know specifically when it stops being, you know, a part of the official military regulations.
Sure. And I like that quote too. I think my military and historical knowledge starts when the Archduke is shot.
Yeah.
So
no, I'm done.
I think we have one more question left, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, yeah. Could teetotalers, if they did receive a ration, could they trade it or sell it?
Yes. So some, and it depends on, it's the teetotaler's discretion. Some of them will pour it out on the ground, which doesn't make them any friends anywhere. But yeah, a lot of them, which I think is morally questionable, maybe, a lot of them will trade it. Not like the Navy, really. So the Navy, you can trade your spirit rations generally for something else. And there are a couple cases of, I think it's been Butler, but right now I'm blanking. There are a couple cases of commanding officers, like for fatigue duty, saying you can have a ration or you can have a bonus. And so teetotalers can get their money if they prefer it. But in other cases, the men just give it to their friends. And this is the part I think is morally questionable. It's like, I'm not going to drink because I think it's a sin, but here you have two. And so that's where the drunkenness, I think, becomes a problem, is that you have some men who aren't drinking their gill at all and other men who are contracting with their teetotaling friends to get like 2 or 3 gills, which we're talking is like a full cup of liquor. So, and commanding officers will try to like say, yeah, you can have that, I'll keep it for you, and they'll sort of give them one every hour or 2 or something like that. But yeah, the teetotaling men, it's just giving it to a buddy. Other times, a few times, they can get cash for it instead. But yeah, there are some options.
And then did they look at beer and wine in the same respect that they looked at, whiskey or brandy?
I think it depends on the person. So the temperance reformers, yes, it's just as bad, slippery slope. I think for other people, no. I think ciders, beers, wines, all those fermented drinks are viewed as a little bit tamer. And again, just to go back to this lack of water, I mean, there's not good water. So drinking cider or beer is really sometimes your best bet to stay hydrated, for better or worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, the image of, pouring nice clean water out of skins, during this time, it's
yeah,
just
not happening.
Well, Dr. Bever, thank you so much for your time today. We greatly enjoyed your talk. I'm getting a lot of great comments down here in the chat. You have access to those, so you can take a look at some of those if you like.
Awesome.
But thank you again for joining us. It really brought up an area of Civil War history that I assume we kind of think about it, but at the same time, the answers always come back as that's obvious and that's clear, when actually the answers are not very obvious and clear at all.
No, not at all. Not at all.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today. Lots of great questions from you. And we're glad that you turned out on this Monday afternoon. Of course, you can find all the rest of our upcoming virtual events and our in-house events at our website, wisbetsmuseum.com/events. We'd love to see you sign up for more or come to some of our in-house events. The pandemic is kind of going away, so we are starting to do a lot more here at the museum, which is fantastic. And I hope everybody has a great Monday, and we'll see everybody next time. Thank you so much.